Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. First of all, an apology ahead of time. You can tell that my voice is still a little bit squirrely, still getting over this really nasty cold that I picked up. We have AI, but AI apparently hasn't figured out how to solve the common cold yet, so I'm looking forward to that happening. You're in for a real treat today. Coming on the podcast is Dr. Daniel Stelter. He's the founder of the German discussion forum Beyond the Obvious, and before that, he worked for decades at BCG, most recently as a senior partner and managing director. I didn't know Daniel personally, but one of our podcast listeners said I was being way too optimistic about Germany on Twitter, which for the record, listeners, anything I say on Twitter automatically should be discounted because you only have so many characters and you can't actually make any nuanced points, but said I was being too optimistic about Germany and that I should talk to Daniel. And I'm really happy to talk to Daniel and to get this sober and corrective view. Here at CI internally, we're actually beginning a big research dive into German quote-unquote deindustrialization. And we talk about that on the podcast. And I'm not going to really tell you what my take is on Germany right now because it's completely under review. I do just want to say at the outset here, though, Daniel made a very, very convincing case that you shouldn't be optimistic at all about Germany or about the European Union. And the one thing that I want to flag for you, he was incredibly articulate and incredibly clear and diagnosed Germany's problems with real surgical precision. But none of the problems, except for maybe demographics, and even there we could talk about it, none of the problems he talked about are not fixable. And it seems to me that Germany can fix most of the things that Daniel talked about. And Daniel has even written books, and we plug some of the books in the podcast, about how Germany could fix itself. And the biggest problems that he pointed out to me are that the political class is not doing it yet. And this goes back to a trope we've been talking about on the podcast for literally years. Authoritarian governments are very good at making reforms and changes because they don't have to care about what the people think. They don't have to be liked. In China, if they want to make a dam where there's a city of 9 billion people, they make the dam and they move the city. That's how they do it. They want to roll out a 5G network. No imminent domain, no legal clashes, no anything like that. It's just you roll out the 5G network. Democracies work a little bit different, and democracy has, many advantages and many virtues. I'm not here to shame talk democracy or anything like that, but in general, in democracy, things do have to get bad before they get better. And I think the one thing, and like I said, I'm redoing my take on Germany. I don't really have a firm position right now, but my instinctual reaction to some of what Daniel said was things just haven't gotten that bad yet. Even with the pandemic, even with the Russia-Ukraine war, Germany hasn't really faced that crisis. And you can see that with the flippancy of German politicians. And that is something that we can relate to here in the English-speaking world as well. So if Germany ever does get a real political transformation, and Daniel talks about how the flip side of that is political radicalization, which can go in a very sort of different and opposite direction. But if you had a real crisis that forced the German political class to either change or ushered in new politicians or anything like that, they could listen to this podcast or go read Daniel's books, and they would know exactly what they would need to do to fix the country. And when you think about a lot of the countries that are out there in the world today in a deglobalizing world where so many things are happening in terms of the energy transition, yes, Germany has all the problems that Daniel talks about here, but most countries would like to have Germany's problems. Many countries don't even have the things that Germany has right now. So I just wanted to say that at the outset, that was sort of my initial reaction before you listen to Daniel and his really excellent arguments, and hopefully he'll come back on and talk more about the Eurozone and about Germany as we go forward. Listeners, if you want access to that research I'm talking about with Germany going forward, you got to email me at jacob@cognitive.investments to talk about subscriptions to the Knowledge platform. I've been really heartened at so many people reaching out via email about the podcast. Please continue doing so. I'm a little bit behind on correspondence just because I've been sick and been traveling, but if you've written to me and I haven't gotten back to you, don't worry. It's on my to-do list. I just got to motor through a few things this week before I get back to you. And I'm trying to answer emails as they come in, but it's really nice to be in touch with you and to talk to all of you. Feels like we're building a little mini podcast community here built on people who want access to real information about geopolitics, which is all I ever wanted this to be. So let's not get too saccharine. Cheers and see you out there.
Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.
Daniel, the first thing I wanted to tell you, or maybe you already know this, I was researching some of your work before the podcast, and there is another man by your name in the United States who is president of the Hobe Sound Bible College in Florida, and he seems to take up a lot of the attention when you're Googling your name in English. So maybe we can displace him. Nice to have you on the podcast.
Well, let's work on this. Thank you for having me.
I wanted to have you on. One of our podcast listeners, reached out to us both on Twitter and said, "Jacob, you're way too optimistic about Germany. You really need to have this guy come on and talk some sense to you about Germany." As some of my listeners know, we've actually just opened a complete review on that optimism on Germany, and we're not 100% optimistic. We actually have a tactical short in one of our investment strategies right now in Germany, so it's not a clear-eyed picture in general. But I thought I would start off just with a really sort of high macro question, which is, why are you pessimistic, or are you pessimistic about Germany? And if you are pessimistic about Germany, what is making you so pessimistic right now?
Well, the short answer is yes, I'm pessimistic. You might say, well, you don't know me, but many people would say, well, he tends to be more pessimistic. But in my view, we have the big risk in Germany of underestimating the challenges we're facing. The Germans, we have the experience that whenever something doesn't go well in the economy, in the end, it turns out good. So in the end, we make reforms. In the end, we have the right products. In the end, everything turns out fine. And therefore, our politicians say, well, as long as the pressure is not hard enough or strong enough, we don't have to do anything, because it's much nicer not to do anything than to do reforms, because reforms are not very popular. And the public says, oh, well, when it's going to be urgent, we are going to make something about it. But until now, let's enjoy and have the good times until it's really necessary. The point is that we have structural challenges. It's not normal restructuring. It's not normal shifts in the structure of an economy, which always happens. But we are facing severe structural problems. The first one is demographics. The workforce in Germany is going to start shrinking this decade, and it's going to shrink next decade a lot more. People talk about a shortage of qualified labor, which we have already today. And the fact is, yes, we have immigration. Yes, we are more open to migration than we've been in the past. But in contrast to other countries like the US, we struggle in attracting talent. What we tend to attract is more people with a lower qualification. And they might contribute in the German society, but it's not as easy as in the US. For example, I remember vividly, I've been in the US often in my life, but a few years back I've been there, and I've been in a burger house. I don't know names and names. One of these great ones. And there was a guy selling these burgers or serving these burgers. And I asked him, well, where are you from? And he said, well, I'm from Syria. And this was at the height when we had this refugee crisis in Germany. I said to him, okay, and for how long are you in the US? And he said, for 2 weeks. And this is a big difference, because if you come from Syria and you're in Germany for 2 weeks, you're not allowed to work. So you're not integrating. You sit there in an asylum house and you wait for processes to take place. You get money from the state. And you attract different people when you do this. If you attract people and say, you come to the US, but it's your own risk, good luck. We hope you are successful. You have a different mindset. So migration up to now has not helped to solve this issue. The second point why I'm skeptical is, you could say, well, you have fewer people, doesn't matter, then you just have to make sure they're more productive. Mm-hmm. And if you look into productivity, you have to see, for a long time now, we face slower and slower productivity growth. Now you will say, well, it's the same true as in the US, in the UK, France, and whatever, but in Germany it's particularly startling. And you can explain it, because what we've done is we managed to integrate, after the reforms in the early 2000s, we managed to integrate low-skilled labor. And then we got migration, and we also managed to integrate many, not all, but many we integrated into the labor market. But it's been low-skilled labor. So this, of course, reflects that you have not huge productivity gains. The problem is the social welfare state in Germany is quite expensive. So you need people to earn good money in order to pay all the contributions in order to keep it running. So we don't have the productivity gains, which is also linked to a problem of education. And I'm aware that also in the US, probably you would say, well, it's not that the education is always doing so fine. Or education system is not probably as fair and equitable. But the point what we're really facing is a phenomenon. According to the grading system, in Germany, we have smarter and smarter young people, because we have really an inflation of great GATE scores. At the same time, we have a higher and higher proportion of the youth going to college, which in Germany has the impact that there are fewer people doing an apprenticeship. And this apprenticeship system in Germany was a very big important factor for having the skilled labor force, because the people in plants working, producing something, they don't need to go to university. What they need is a good education. So the education system on the surface looks good. But if you look into international comparisons, you see that a German schooling system is lacking excellence, and it's deteriorating. It's deteriorating at a fast pace. Give you one example. There's a so-called IGLO study, which looks at the reading and math abilities, but mainly reading abilities of fourth graders. So this would be a range of 10-year-old. And the study found that a quarter of German fourth graders lack basic skills in reading. And the study says, and this gap in reading ability is so big that these kids already today have a very, very poor prognosis concerning future performance in school. And there are other studies showing the same for math. And then last data point, about 50% of the Chinese pupils in Shanghai and Beijing managed to be in the top performing group in math. In Germany, it's less than 5%. So we have fewer people, we have fewer children, and we are educating them less well. And then in the end, when they go to college, unfortunately, we have a proliferation of studies which might be nice, but which are not necessarily the ones are highly specialized and highly industrial country like Germany needs. So we don't have enough, MINT studies, so mathematics, engineering, sciences, technology. And we have many more people studying social sciences, politics, history, and whatsoever, which is all nice, don't get me wrong, but it's not the real skill sets the German economy needs. Not in total, some yes, but not the certain number. And so the schooling system falls apart. Now first point is we have fewer people, and unfortunately we don't educate them well. Now the third point, you would expect that you've got to get great infrastructure when you're in Germany. So a fast train, reliable train, fast motorways. I know the Americans who come to Germany in order to drive, low speed limit motorways. Yes, there are still some parts of the motorway system which are without speed limit, but most of them have a speed limit, also due to the fact that the roads are not in good condition. The trains in Germany is so unreliable that Switzerland and Austria, which you of course have a lot of connecting traffic with, they sometimes stop delayed trains from Germany, at the border basically. It's the first station and say, well, we take it from here, you go back, whatever, because you're so late. So it's not happening. Why? Because we had a good time, but the government has failed to invest reasonable amounts in infrastructure. So we have a deteriorating infrastructure, and at the same time, not only in the physical infrastructure, but also in digitalization. If you look at digitalization, Germany is, I think, before the UK left, the UK was worse than Germany, but this was within the EU. Well, now we might have recovered a little bit, but we are clearly far below average concerning digitalization. And at the same time, we still have high taxes and high social welfare contributions. So we have a government, we have a state taking away a lot of money, not doing its homework, because they also didn't do their homework in equipping our military, as you know, etc., etc. And then, having discussed this already, we have another issue, which is energy. Sorry you asked me, but it's a long answer. Yeah?
No,
but energy,
I'm happy
and the short version is energy is wealth. Having access to cheap energy, having sufficient energy is wealth. And there's a strong correlation between the wealth of a country per capita and energy consumption. This does not mean that you have to be as inefficient in using energy as the Germans would claim the US is, but there's a correlation. And what we've done is we have said we are embarking on a great experiment. The Wall Street Journal quoted it, the world's most stupid energy policy, which is true. We shut down nuclear power plants, we build windmills and solar modules and farms, which are produced in China, by the way. After we have subsidized them with nearly 100 billion euros, Now we subsidize an industry which is now based in China. It's also very interesting. And in the end, we find out that, energy is very expensive. And politicians keep on telling us, well, we have to finish this and it's going to be cheap. But because they say, well, once the wind is blowing and once the sun is shining, the energy is cheap, which is true. The problem is they don't shine all the time, or the wind is not always blowing. And the second point is you need huge overcapacities, you need a new grid structure, you need backups, you need storage. And if you include all of this, it's outrageously expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And now comes my last point. My last point is, if now our government would follow me up to here in my assessment, they might be willing to act. I'm not really sure if they would really be willing to act, but we could still act. But they don't do this. They say we continue it even worse.
Yeah.
And if you want, maybe to add one more point is the European Union. The euro. If you take the euro is Germany. Without Germany, the euro is history. So Germany is a backstop of the euro. And if you don't have, at the same time, we have huge contributions to the Eurozone and to Europe, to the EU. So currently, politicians say, we have to put the EU and Europe ahead of Germany. Other countries see differently. So France is clearly France first, and then we talk about the EU. Mm-hmm. And so we have also a government which is not taking on our interest when it comes to the European Union. And now we come to the global framework, and the US is has some issues with China, as we all know. So Germany says, okay, we become the moral world champion, and we criticize everyone in the world who is not behaving correctly with human rights and whatsoever, which I have personally lots of sympathy for. But the fact is then the business is done by others. It's not done by the Germans anymore. And then I say, well, it's a pretty high price to pay for a country which is highly export dependent, in which is all the issues are just summarized and should address these issues. And the better the economy runs, the easier it is to do these reforms and address these issues. Once the economy doesn't run well, and the government doesn't have the money, the tax income, whatever, it's going to become nearly impossible to resolve. And the point is here again, we only have a very small time window in order to act. Why? Because the boomers, the German baby boomers are a bit younger than the American baby boomers. So I'm born 1964, so I'm an old white man, as you see. And this old white man, there were never as many young German babies like in 1964. So it was a total top. So in a few years' time, 5 years' time, I'm allowed to retire. And once we retire, we are going to say, we worked very hard, which we did, and we paid a lot of contribution taxes. Now it's our time to get all the social welfare. And I know that the US system is also not really funded. Yeah, but the point is here, you don't change a society then, because then the clear majority is going to be retired or close to retiring, and they have a different perspective. And that's why I'm skeptical about the ability and the willingness of Germany to reform. And here I think my fellow citizens are on a wrong track when they say, no problem at all, we just enjoy 2 or 3 more years with our high pensions and others, and then there will be reform. No, we have a very small time window to fix things, and my worry is that we won't. So, Robert, long answer, sorry.
Don't apologize. We have a lot to work through there, but I want to talk through some of what you said, and a lot of it I find myself in agreement with. But the one that surprised me the most was education. And in this sense, I think the United States and Germany may have some things in common. I was speaking at an event in North Dakota last week, and was talking about how the same sort of thing is happening in the United States. Education is getting more and more expensive. People are going into softer and softer sciences. I was a social science major. If I could go back and do it again, I would have done something probably a little more hard science and a little more useful maybe in the new economy that we're going towards. But one of the things I heard from some of my contacts, there were some kids in North Dakota, they don't want to go to college. They're going straight, like you said, to trade schools, or going straight to, hey, I want to be a stonemason, or I want to be an electrician, or I want to be a plumber, because you can go make $90,000, $100,000 straight out of school once you kind of do the education for for 2-3 years. It's kind of weird to me, because if Germany has such a great social welfare state, why is it failing so much on education? In the United States, we fail in education we don't invest enough money and we don't pay teachers enough, and every state is for itself. Like, I can kind of go through it, but why is Germany having such trouble educating people? That's the one in the list that I was not expecting you to say.
Yeah. The point is, you are mistaking social welfare with investing in schools and education. Social welfare is the same in the US like in Germany. It's redistribution of money. So I give you an example. We just had a discussion around Germany as a government, as they decided it, to increase the so-called childhood, I would say, basic insurance. It's not an insurance, but it's basically basic payment. Like, for example, we have the problem of having childhood poverty, and we say, what we have to do is we have to give more money to these families. So we are combining what we do into one program, and we are going to add more resources. So if you now look into more detail, who are these children? Most of them have an immigrant background. So they come from families with many kids, lack of language skills, lack of integration in the German labor market. So you give these families more money. And don't get me wrong, you might say it's simple. I have more sympathy for it because you want to make sure that no one is in poverty. But giving them more money is not an incentive for them to send their kids to kindergarten early on, so they don't learn language. So, for example, the German government has invested in the past years a lot into increasing the number of available places at kindergarten. But the part of society which would need it the most, the children of the immigrants, because to learn language, they go the least. So we cover the problem with money, but in doing so, we don't have the incentive for the family to engage in the labor market, and we don't have an incentive to send to kindergarten. So the right approach would be to say, you want to have money? Yes, there's a precondition. The precondition for you to get the money is your kid attends the kindergarten in order to learn German. That's what we don't do. At the same time, we have the discussions that if you have 3-4 kids and you have, you're not very well educated, then you're better off in living from social welfare than to go to work. And that's a huge difference to the US. My understanding is in the US, you got the negative income tax, something like this. In the beginning, you have a negative, and then this is a brilliant system. The point for us is our social welfare system, the base level is so high that we can't do this then, because then the progression is very high. So, for example, if you are living on social welfare and you start working, it might be that from the additional euro you earn, up to 80% is taken away because you get less money from the government, or you have to start paying to the government. And if you have, you say, okay, I work and I have to give away 80%, why should I work? And that's a problem. So we don't address the root causes. We cover them up with more and more transfers. And the second point is, I think there's also, the OECD, they always said, you have to increase the number of academics, blah, blah, blah. So that's what Germany has done. And we had this very good dual system. Basically you do an apprenticeship, you learn a profession, and at the same time you also go to a special school teaching you some other aspects. And this was very attractive. It only exists in Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. And I know, for example, the UK is looking intensively into it. Many countries would love to have the system. Yeah. But we have basically destroyed it. So today, basically most kids see their only way to make a living in studying something. And I'm with you, to be honest, in the future we have a huge gap in having electricians and other people actually doing, this kind of work. And in the end, they will make a lot of money if they also do it. But the problem still is, and it's too late, because we basically don't educate our talent pool in the way we should educate it, given our economic needs. And by the way, we spoke about demographics. Let me also add that the terrifying number is that up to 200,000 Germans are leaving the country each year. As they are immigrating to the US, for example, or to Australia, or to UK, or whatever, Switzerland. Why? Because they get better incomes, because they have lower taxation, and we have to also admit that these tend to be younger people and better educated people. So that's a fundamental problem. And so, but we talk about migration and we don't talk about how to keep those who are already here. How to make Germany more attractive to be here. Don't get me wrong, Germany is a great country to live in. We have beer gardens and we have good healthcare, and in the end, still the motorways are doing fine and whatever. But it's not as good as it used to be, and we are losing compared to neighbors like Switzerland significantly and visibly.
Well, I think we're all losing compared to Switzerland, and they have unique advantages that most of us can't enjoy. But I mean, another thing that I would ask you then, I mean, it sounds like one of the issues with demographics is that the migrants that Germany is bringing in, they're having a difficult time integrating. But the Russia-Ukraine war, is tragic, but also presents a tremendous opportunity in this score. I mean, Poland is enjoying a tremendous demographic dividend because a lot of a lot of Ukrainians are settling in Poland. You also have the Western Balkans sitting right there. So is Germany not still maybe attractive to the 40 million Ukrainians who don't want to be living in a war zone for the next 2 years?
No, of course, there are more than 1 million who came to Germany, and they are, as a big contrast to the others, they are allowed to work from day one onwards. And many of them are doing it. Clearly, they are also more inclined and returning towards Ukraine. Yes, it's an opportunity, but you have to think about the following. Imagine, hopefully, the war is over tomorrow. Let's say the war is over tomorrow. Then you have to rebuild Ukraine. And it's going to be rebuilt with Western money. So Germany is going to give a lot of money in order to rebuild Ukraine. Who is going to rebuild Ukraine when the good Ukrainians are not in Ukraine anymore, but in Germany or in France or in Switzerland? If they're even Switzerland, they're everywhere. So the point is, actually, what you want to attract is you want to attract talent from the world, but you don't have to pay money for rebuilding or whatsoever. So it would be, for example, much better for us to attract people from India, more people from India to Germany. But now think about an Indian. An Indian sits there and says, okay, I want to immigrate. Now, we can be for sure qualified migrants. I'm sure one thing they can do, they can calculate. They sit there and say, okay, first hurdle is language. Okay, then German actually is already out. But let's say, okay, I don't mind. I like German language. I learn German. But then they look and say, okay, I go to Germany. The first point is I don't get a house or an apartment because they don't build enough. We have a lack of apartments. Why? Because we had the huge wave of migration, which was not controlled. And at the same time, we didn't build new houses. So you don't have to be Einstein in order to understand that if you have people moving into your country and you don't build, that you get a leakage of living room. So it's expensive and difficult to get. Then they say, oh, by the way, school system is also not good because normally people who are qualified and talented also like to have their kids good education. And then you say, oh, by the way, and I make 5,000, which is less than what I would make in the US. And by the way, and on these 5,000, I get even less because I have to pay very high taxes. And so it is a fundamental problem. Now, you said, well, you're not so skeptical about, Jacob, about Germany. Germany still has strengths. We still have strong industrial sectors. We still have the mid-sized hidden champions. We still have an ecosystem which works very well between universities and research and companies. But it's eroding. Already before Corona or before all this mess, the German industrial sector was shrinking. The share of industrial production was shrinking already since 2017. And keep in mind, we also foster some change, like, for example, in the automotive industry. So if we now move all to EVs, and we don't now go down the road as to whether an EV is really beneficial to the climate, blah, blah, blah. In the end, we all know if you want to save the climate, it doesn't matter if you drive an old combustion engine or an EV, because there are other areas which have much more impact on CO2 emissions and blah, blah, blah. So it doesn't matter. But it matters in a certain sense. If you go all to EV, all competitive edge of the German industry is gone. The good engine, gone. The good gearbox, gone. Because it doesn't matter anymore. So all the competitive advantage of Germany's car industry is gone. And we will see how the Chinese are now going to invade. You see in China, for example, German companies are already struggling. And now the Chinese are coming to Europe. And then you think, so, okay, if now the car industry in Germany gets into trouble, this is going to be a big issue, because it's not only the car, not only the OEMs, but also the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers to these OEMs. This is an issue. At the same time, the high energy cost is an issue. We know that the chemical industry is struggling. And at the same time, we've got the Americans who say, by the way, here we are, energy is just a fifth of Germany, and we have much lower taxes and taxation. And by the way, if you come here and you invest in green technologies, you get the special depreciation and subsidy. You got the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is, excuse my translation, which is nothing else than a debt-financed, protectionist program to subsidize the reindustrialization of the US. Fine. But, it's totally fine. I think that's a good, clever strategy if you want to go down this path. And the Germans are sitting there and say, okay, we should do something about it. But we have to do it in the EU because otherwise the others are unhappy because we can afford it, the others can't afford it. Well, Italy has 140% of GDP debt and we only 60%. Isn't it unfair? I could say, well, but if the Italians have spent the money before, why should we not? Anyway, so we are going to go for this solidarity approach, and in the end it takes long, and the bureaucrats, and then you ask Mrs. von der Leyen what she is doing, and so it's doomed to fail. So we have an agile world, and Europe and Germany is falling behind. Just think about the German industries. Which industries come to your mind?
Well, the car industry comes first. I mean, I think of Siemens and big sort of, making big industrial machines and things like that.
Yeah. All of these industries were already around, and we still had an emperor. You are laughing, but it's true.
Well, it's...
You can say, well, SAP might be the exception. Well, besides this, cars, machinery equipment, chemicals, it's all been around when we still had an emperor, which was until 1918, until the end of the First World War. And that's a big problem. We have improved all of this, and we have, of course, there's some new like laser cutting and whatsoever, but it's all based on this strength in machinery, equipment, or whatsoever. And I had in my podcast, as I told you, I do a podcast as well. I had in my podcast as a CEO of a chemical company, and I asked him, well, if the chemical industry were invented today, and you would, sit in the universe and look at the Earth and say, okay, where on the Earth I'm going to start this industry? Would you start in Germany? And he said right away, never. So it's been based off historically unique situation at the time being. We had just jump back 150 years. When was Germany industrializing? At the time being, we had a growing workforce. We had a world-class education system for all of them. Germany was the role model for education, for everyone, for those people going to go apprentice and for those people who are going to become Nobel Prize winners. Keep in mind, before the Second World War, I think most Nobel Prize winners were Germans. And they are based in Germany. There are some Germans, but they are normally doing their research in the US and not anymore in Germany. We had a government which has low taxation, but did its homework. They built a railway network. In contrast to today, we don't have, a broadband network, which we should have. Mm-hmm. We had economic freedom, and we had, what's very interesting is we had very efficient bureaucracy. The bureaucracy actually is the wrong word for it. It was civil servants. It was a very, very professional civil service system. Today we have bureaucracy. And all this combined makes it extremely difficult for companies to perform in Germany. Actually, if you look for a next discussion partner for your podcast, there is a think tank in Australia. I have to look up the name. I can send it to you via email in case you want to put it in the show notes. Yeah. And they looked into the 44 top technologies for the future. So key technologies for the future. And they say 37 out of these 44 are already today dominated by the Chinese. And they said in 25 of these cases, China stands a chance of achieving a quasi-monopoly. The other 7 of these top sectors are dominated by the US. None by the European Union. And then if you look into the individual rankings, you see, okay, sometimes Germany shows up in number 3, number 4, but with a 5% share, and the Chinese or the US is 30%. So it's a huge difference. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm saying, and I speak to people in Germany, and I'm not doing an investment podcast, but I always say, if you are young and educated, look to work abroad, just give it a try. And if you're investing your money, make sure you go do a global diversification. Don't invest. Don't buy a house in Germany and a flat to rent out, and then don't buy the DAX. But you should be globally diversified and also participate in regions which are have a better demographics and which are better managed. The second point, I have to admit, is difficult to find, because it's not the case that everything in the world is brilliant. Just in our case, it's difficult. I think it's also, and I'm not in the US, but I would say also the US has some challenges.
Yeah, I have one story for you, which is probably the exception, not the rule, but it's anecdotal, which is I had a very, very close friend who she couldn't find a job in a lab here in the United States that would take her. So she went to Germany and she worked for one of the major biotech companies and was working on there in cancer research and everything else. So I have at least one story in my background of an American who fled to Germany to try and find sort of cutting edge biotech that might sort of light your hair on fire. But
no, that's brilliant. No, it's great. I love to hear it, and it's great. It's great. Now I could of course say BioNTech, which is our famous company who invented the Pfizer COVID vaccine. Just so you always say it's Pfizer, but let's face it, Pfizer bought it.
Because we have better marketing.
Anyhow, and the funny point is this company has now decided to have its cancer research in Cambridge in the UK. Well, look, we talk anecdotically here, but the bottom line is Germany faces challenges. They are not acknowledged. And in my view, in my humble opinion, we don't have so much time to change it given the demographics. And if you talk about education, in order to fix education, even if you fix it tomorrow, it takes years
a generation,
for having an impact. On the productivity and on the innovativeness of our society.
All right, well, I want to turn to talking about how to fix this in the Eurozone in general. But just before we leave this particular topic, deindustrialization is sort of the big buzzword. It's in the FT, it's in Bloomberg. Germany's deindustrializing, everything's bad. And I know that you made the tongue-in-cheek comment about the industries have been around since the emperor. Well, that's because we need these industries. We need the chemicals and we need the machinery and all these other things. And the need for that's probably not going away. And if certain countries don't want to import from China, there are very few countries out there with the technical know-how and the plant and all these other sorts of things. But when you were talking, it almost sounded like your answer to this question would be, well, Germany's already deindustrialized. What are you talking about? This is past tense.
It's not deindustrialized. No, but as I said before, the share of the industry and GDP is shrinking since a few years already. But we still have a higher level than the US and France and the UK. The question is going forward. Look, most of the German companies are now global players. So think about BASF, the chemical company. They are very strong in Germany, but they are strong in China and they are strong in the US. So now they have decided to reduce production in Germany and they are going to increase production in China, but also heavily investing in the US. So those companies which have more of a global footprint, they gradually start shifting in other areas. The second point is we don't have hope on better energy prices. The politicians always say, okay, once we have built more windmills and we have more solar farms, then energy is going to be very cheap. No, it's not. They say, okay, we are going to build a hydrogen economy. And very funny, there was a very good article a few months back in the Financial Times where it's a calculation, and it's just the cost of hydrogen is just staggering. You can say whatever you want, but it's not cheaper than natural gas. Very simple. And there came now a study in Germany, even from a very highly recognized institution, saying basically the same. So basically, it's 4 to 5 times the current natural gas price is going to be hydrogen. So the scenario is Germany is going to have for probably forever higher energy prices as others. Now you can say, well, but if you're honest, it was always the case that energy was not as cheap in Germany as in other countries. Yes, this is true. Probably it was not true 150 years ago when we used coal, but since we have to import oil and others, yes, it's true. But then we have made the mistake of exiting nuclear energy. So companies say, well, there's not a scenario of energy coming back. Now you could overcompensate it by having more productive labor force, having lower wages. You could basically say, okay, if energy is more expensive, you have lower wages, it's the price you pay for it. And if you're productive, then it still makes sense. It's still profitable to produce in Germany. But now, as we face a shrinking workforce, you don't have to be, it's very simple to assume wages are going to rise because demand goes up. And this means profit margins get squeezed by two levers: high energy prices and rising labor costs. You can try to make it up with productivity gains, but this is going to be difficult to achieve. You have to invest. We all know productivity gains require you to invest. And then comes a point when companies say, if I anyhow have to invest, does it make sense to invest here? And therefore my scenario is, due to the decarbonization trend, of the wish of decarbonization, of the wish of making fossil fuels more expensive, etc., etc. You know this, and we don't go down this path as to whether it's sensible or not. It leads to the fact that the factor of energy is becoming more and more a decisive factor for energy-intensive industries. And as German industry tends to be energy-intensive, of course, you have to keep in mind, we're already very efficient. We are extremely efficient in Germany compared to our neighbors. But now you can't make it up as efficiency anymore. And then you will migrate. So it's a study I just mentioned from just Fraunhofer, the study which is highly reputed German institute. They say, we can import hydrogen, for example, from North Africa. And it's going to cost whatever, 137 euro per megawatt hour, whatever, which is already expensive. And then they say, but we have to, of course, keep in mind that these countries will also need the energy, and we have to discuss with them. So these countries have now two options. They produce hydrogen to be shipped to Germany, to be used in factories in Germany. Or they say, how about you building the factories here? We don't ship it around. And this is happening. And you think about the Saudis and the Chinese. The Chinese are selling the Saudis now the equipment, the chemical equipment, the petrol, refinery, whatever they need, chemical industry. They are building a chemical industry in Saudi Arabia. And if I were the Prince of Saudi Arabia, of course I wouldn't do the nasty things he has done, but I would clearly think about building a local industry there. And then you say, okay, because they got solar power in the desert, I'm pretty sure. So they say, okay, we have a cost competitive structure here. So it's migrating. And I fear that's a battle we can't win. It's not a big bang and tomorrow Germany is deindustrialized. No, we are going to lose wealth, first relatively to the others, which we already do. I did a calculation, had the GDP in Germany grown like in the US in the past 10 years, we would have 4,000 euro per capita more GDP in Germany. Not bad. That's a big difference. So it's going to be first relative. We are not anymore number 5, 6 in the world. We're number 10. Who cares? But then it's going to be absolute. Then it's going to be shrinking levels of wealth, of basically ability to fund social welfare, to pay for the retired people, to pay for the healthcare system. And then what you get is severe social consequences and much more radicalization of politics. Currently, we have the radicalization of politics due to the migration policy, which is for everyone who has a neutral view on it, just to say what we are doing is totally crazy, stupid, because we don't look into getting people who are going to help us solve our problems, but people who might even add to our problems. But this is the crowd. But once we see the loss in wealth, then you get a political radicalization. And this has not only implications for Germany, but for the whole European Union.
Let's stay on that for a little bit, because it segues nicely into what I wanted to ask you about, which is when we look at everything you've talked about here, and it's very convincing, and demographics is the one, there's no magic wand we can wave and make demographics go away. But productivity, if Germany is so low on digitalization, well, maybe if you digitalized a little bit, maybe you could get some really high productivity gains. Infrastructure, Germany still knows how to build infrastructure. Throw a bunch of money at infrastructure. Stop this asinine energy policy. Build new nuclear reactors. Get the nuclear back online. Stop screwing around with all the other stuff. And maybe the war ends and there's cheap Russian natural gas coming from a liberal democracy based in Moscow. I don't know. It sounds like as you said, there may be a limited amount of time, but unlike most countries in the world that I feel like I deal with from a geopolitical perspective, it sounds like there are solutions to these problems. The most, besides education, the most concerning thing you talked about was Germany's political class seems to be willing to do nothing. And I mean, I've been making fun of Olaf Scholz on the podcast now for a couple of weeks, ever since he emerged with the eye patch. Like, in general, the German government doesn't seem to know what it's doing, but one man's radicalization is another man's political revolution, political transformation. Do you think that things are going to get bad enough to bring in a government that says, we don't care that the reforms are unpopular? We can either collapse as a unified entity, or we can make these tough reforms and move forward. Is that plausible? Do you think there's any chance of that? Or do you just think it's too far gone and the baby boomers, as you said, want to be in the beer garden and have a nice time and enjoy the fruits of their labor?
Well, there's a German saying, hope is the last thing which dies. So I don't know if it gets across in English, but so basically I would say, yes, I would hope for it. So in the reforms, for example, of all what you've mentioned, I think having a better migration policy would be highly popular. Having nuclear power plants up and running would be popular. The majority of Germans have in last polls all supported of keeping them, not shutting them down. They will still shut it down, which of course already tells you what's happening. So there are parties, there are politicians who insist on policies because of their own party base, although the majority of the public has changed its view. And this makes it extremely difficult. And so I have to tell you, I'm skeptical because, as I said at the beginning, the basic problem I see is that probably the political class says it's not so bad. So if you wanna make joke about Olaf Scholz, so he gave an interview last week. I don't know when you are going to publish this podcast, but on the September 16th or whatever, in the Sunday newspaper, and he was saying, well, Germany is like a sailing boat, a very well run sailing boat, and we are going to weather all the storms. And then he kept on telling the fairy tale how hydrogen and all this is going to make everything cheap, and energy is going to be cheap and everything's fine. I would just say, look, Olaf, when you read the studies of the leading institutes, they say everything, but they might say it's possible, but nowhere they say it's going to be cost competitive. Forget about it. And then we have Robert Habeck replying to the Economist cover. The Economist cover with a green man, which I found very funny because green policies was I thought, yes, green policies is a major reason for being where we are. And by green, I don't necessarily mean only for this government, because the governments before already were under pressure of the Greens, so that it's this policy. And it was a man where I would say, okay, normally a man, well, I'm not really sure, probably should be transsexual or whatsoever. So I found it a bit not so really nice as being a man, but anyhow. And Habeck was replying to this in The Economist by invitation. And he said, well, it's all not so bad. We got the strengths and we are going to fix it. And it's typical Germans. They have angst, but there's no point in having angst. And that's the basic problem. They still believe it is the case. So our chancellor speaks about Germany like a strong sailing boat in order to weather all the storms. Now I'll tell you what the story is. We have the sailing boat. We have not invested for a long time in repairing some stuff. So, the wood is already shaken. We have a few leakages and the tent or whatever. So the material is all, we're not really sure. We have a crew on board to sail it who have not learned how to sail. Poor education system. Mm-hmm. We have more and more former crew members who are now saying, okay, I like sailing, I sit here around, but I don't do anymore. You do the sailing. We have a captain who believes everything is great. At the same time, we have overloaded the boat with problems. We have overloaded in one regard. We said, okay, we don't need an engine. We do sailing without, we don't have a backup engine. We don't need a backup engine because it's bad, it's fossil, whatever. So we shut down, nuclear power plants. We don't need it. And secondly, we said, okay, we want to prove the world that we in Germany, also the sun is not shining as much, and also the wind is not blowing so much, and also our industry needs a lot of energy. We are going to demonstrate to the world we can make it. So we also added to the sailing boat a few stones to make it more heavy. On one side, so the boat is already having whatever. Then we have a migration policy where we have people coming who don't know how to sail or who don't want to sail at all. So they join the others sitting on the boat. They have more weight. And then we have the captain and his crew saying, and now we are going to see, there are some clouds, there are some dirty, dark clouds, there might be bad weather coming. Should we bypass it? No, we sail straight into the weather because we're such a great boat. So our foreign minister has nothing better to say than Mr. Xi is a dictator. Mr. Xi doesn't like it. I can say, well, is he a dictator? I don't, probably. But, is it helpful? What did we gain by saying to the press and the media, Mr. Xi is a dictator? What did we gain? Nothing. We just made sure that the Chinese probably will say, well, the next time we have a choice between Germany and someone else, we take someone else. So this is the situation. And the storm is coming. We got deglobalization. We got the potential conflict between China and the US. We have, by no means, we see an end in the war with Russia and Ukraine. I just, and we have people saying we've got a strong sailing boat and everything is fine. It was his remark because they, of course, also started with this pirate look. He's not Johnny Depp. He's Olaf Scholz. That's a huge difference. And you want to think about it. I don't know about how many jokes about it, but keep in mind, he traveled to South America to look for lithium and raw materials for the German industry. And wherever he came, he was greeted friendly and people told him, by the way, but the Chinese have already bought it.
Right.
And then he went to Mr. Lula and said, Mr. Lula, you should send weapons. And Mr. Lula said, well, I think, no, the Russians have a point and China should. And then Scholz was and then he said, but we should have this trade deal. And he said, well, we don't like your policy because this Lieferkettengesetz. I don't know what's the German in English. So basically, where you have to prove that whatever, the kautschuk, whatever you're using was not produced with child for labor and whatever. Which is, I have lots of sympathy for it. Lots of sympathy because I think it's good to do the good thing. But the point still is, they say, we don't like it because it is a disadvantage for our competitors. No one likes it. It's much too bureaucratic. So the Germans, politicians are living in the fairy tale of a rich country. I'm promoting my own book, which don't need to do because no one is going to read it because it's German. It appeared in 2018. It's called The Fairy Tale of the Rich Country. And you listen to a German politician, he or she, or whatever, they say, a rich country like Germany should, whatever, get out of nuclear energy and show the world we can do it. Be open to all migrants in the world. Pay more social welfare. Have higher pensions. They're rich. And by no means, if you look at the private wealth of Germans relative to the economic, the size of the economy, this data by the Credit Suisse, the Global Wealth Report, we have half the wealth like the Italians relative to, and still we are paying transfers to Italy. And I just say, well, yes, but actually, Italy is a rich country that just managed to have a poor state, and they do this. But with a good reason, because they know when the state has too much money, they are not doing good stuff with it. So the Italians say, we don't trust the government, so we make sure they don't have money. The Italians, they owe the government 1,100 billion euro. That's what the Italians owe the Italian government. And I say, how about taxing your own people before you? Anyhow, so we are ruled by people who have very idealistic views of the world and combine it with a fundamental 100% lack of understanding of what makes Germany successful, or if they understand it, they don't see how big the risks are for our success factors of not being success factors anymore.
Yeah. One of our largest listener bases is in Canada, and as you're talking, I think Canadians will find a lot that they agree with and a lot that they sympathize with in your description. And also, don't sleep on the book plug. Germany's the 5th largest audience of this podcast, and I also have Austrian family, so I'll tell them all to buy your book, and the 5th of German listeners who listen to the podcast should buy your book.
But let me tell you also one experience, a personal experience. The book of the fairy tale, I think it's for 60,000 copies, which is for German standards and for a very good number. And then I wrote another book, Successor. Okay, I changed the publisher, but that's not the point. And it was basically how to reform Germany. It's called The Dream of a Country. So it's basically where I say, okay, what should we do? How do we increase labor force participation, whatever. And I tell you, it sold 6,000 copies. The problem is reforming is hard work, it's boring, it's not popular. Even not reading about it is not popular. And so have to do it. And that's the basic problem. So and let's look at the US. The US is covering, it's basically doing everything now on borrowed money. huge deficits. We all know this. It's a big difference to Germany. I'm very much in favor of running bigger deficits in Germany as well, to be very clear. On the other hand, I'm not happy of running bigger deficits if it means having higher transfers within Europe, because we don't have anything from it. And the second point is I'm not in favor of it if the money is spent as it currently spent, because it's more on transfers and social welfare and migration or whatsoever. So we have to invest it really into the country. And we have one issue here. The demographics is already hurting us here. We don't have the people to build the streets. We don't have the people to build the digitalization. Because in the past years, we underinvested. And if you underinvest, you lose also the talent.
Yeah.
So in one other point, if you compare Germany with the other European countries, Denmark is leading in digitalization of the public service. So I say Denmark is a neighbor country. It's a European country. It's a member of the EU. It's a liberal democracy. Why can't we just go to Denmark and say, we buy your digital system for the public, everything, totally. We just translate it into German. And then we just teach our public service. And then they basically like moving into a new office, they move a new system. You know, this IT legacy systems. Mm-hmm. We should, instead of trying, but we say, no, we have to have our own model, and we have every country, because all these countries in Germany, they all have to say something. It's a total disaster. And we have to change this mindset. We have to say, okay, Denmark, how many billions? Get it. Get it done. And I would tell you, the Danish would even program it and do it for us. I'm sure they would be happy for such a contract. And we just say, why don't we do it? And this comes down to our politicians having lack of understanding, lack of, and if there's understanding, the lack of willingness to do it, and in the end, all the lack of competence of executing against it. Yeah. And that's why I say, divest. You are short on one stock in Germany or a few stocks is fine. I'd have to tell you that I don't understand the good performance of the DAX this year. I have to admit, but I'm not an investor. But down the road, long term, mid to long term, I'm short.
Yeah, I mean, I think the performance over the last 12 months, you have to think back to 12 months ago. You know, The Economist was talking about German grandmothers freezing in the street because it was the end of the European economy because of high natural gas prices. So we had this hysteria, and so we're coming from that sort of generational low. I think that's why you have the outperformance. Now we're sort of stuck in this, okay, it's hanging out there, and everybody thinks natural gas prices are going to stay this low forever. So, you know, now you start to get pessimistic because what was hysteria has become complacency. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you a question here I hope you'll come back on the podcast. This has been great. I'm going to ask you a question that is impossible to answer in just a few minutes, and maybe you can come back and talk about it more. But I sort of have to ask you about the Eurozone and what you think about the prospects of the Eurozone, because if Germany really is falling off a cliff like you're talking about here, and we can go back and forth about that as long as we want, Germany, it doesn't seem to me that the Eurozone can survive its beating heart, just sort of not being ripped out of itself, but slowly fading into nothingness. So, I mean, I would assume that you're also very pessimistic about the European Union, or are there pockets like a Denmark or a Poland that you see, well, these have some of the things that you need for growth, and Germany is just going to be pulled along by the rest of it? Sort of just give me a short take on the European Union, and then we can come back and do a whole thing if you want.
The short take is, structurally, I'm negative, but it's going to look. Germany is not exploding. Germany is going to deteriorate over time. Eroding is the right word. And the same holds true for Europe. And I would say they will cover it up as money. They will cover it up as new debt on the European level. They will talk about the Hamilton moment. Also, it's not a Hamilton moment because the local governments, the individual states can still make debt in the contrast to the US. So they will basically cover it up as more and more debt. And buy time by this. So we will just take on more debt, we will print more money, inflation will be reasonable, whatever, 3-5%, because of all the other factors, demographics, decarbonization, etc. They will do a bit of financial repression, and they will basically print money. The problem is just that this will mean another 1 to 3 lost decades for Europe, with significant underperformance compared to the US and compared to other regions in the world. It will mean that the talent is going to move, more talent is going to move out to the US and other countries where there are more prospects for the future, or to Canada, to the listeners in Canada. And so it's going to, basically the erosion process is going to continue. And then sometime there will be some stage. Sometime there will be a moment where it basically is going to end, and it will be like a poof. It will not be a big bang. It will sometime. But it will take time because the willingness of politicians to stand in it, to go to the last moment is very high. So, but it just fits into the picture of this eroding wealth, this eroding power of Europe. And if you look into all the data already now, you can say Europe is claiming to be relevant to the world. But if you're honest, China, the US, they move along. Technology is moving along. It's very funny. The Americans invent artificial intelligence, and the Europeans are proud of being the first to regulate it. This gives you the summary of Europe.
Before I let you go, so are you going to retire in Germany, or are you going to retire elsewhere in the world?
It's a good question. Without going too much into my family details, my wife and I are just undergoing a process of clarifying what we should do after nearly 35 years of marriage, which is fair. I think you should check as to whether you continue together or not, and then you can also discuss the question of where you want to do this. I got 3 children, and I can tell you, and I want to excuse myself to all your listeners, my 3 children, they speak all mother tongue English, because this was my clear goal that having just had school English, I just said I want to make sure that their English is mother tongue, which makes them globally mobile, and currently none of them is based in Germany.
Well, on that note, Daniel, this was great. I hope you'll come back on, and thank you so much for making the time. It was a really great conversation.
Jacob, a pleasure on my side.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.